Hello, welcome to another Risk Management Professionals webinar. My name is Saige McCluskey, a project engineer here at RMP, and today I'll be talking about the new RMP rule, Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention, for Program 3 facilities specifically. Okay, before we get started, I implore you to go to the RMP website and watch the June 2024 Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention, the new RMP rule, presented by my colleague Ryan Bray. That presentation gives a detailed background of the RMP rule, how it's developed over the years, and the reasoning behind it. Ryan also gives an in-depth breakdown of how this new rule will affect Program 1 and Program 2 facilities. I've created this presentation as an add-on to specifically address Program 3 facilities and the changes that Program 3 facilities need to be aware of. At the end of the presentation, I'll also list a few dates that should be marked on your facility's calendar. The new rule brought with it a lot of proposed changes. To break down these changes into easily digestible chunks, I've separated the updates into 4 main areas. For Program 3 facilities, the bulk of these changes will exist within the prevention program. After that, we'll go into our changes for the emergency response, information availability, and lastly, we'll touch on other areas of technical clarification. As I mentioned, the bulk of our updates or our changes we'll have to make for Program 3 facilities is within a prevention program. As you can see here, the list on the right is all the main areas that will need your attention to stay within compliance. We're going to start with our process safety information, look at a process hazard analysis, operating procedures, compliance audits, incident investigations, employee participation, and lastly, hot work permits. So jumping into process safety information. This first item is most likely already taking place at your Program 3 facility. This item was most likely recognized as a gap as this program element was being reviewed for the update. So previously, it was only a requirement for Program 2 facilities to have their process safety information kept up to date. So with this update, it is now a requirement for Program 3 facilities to keep up-to-date PSI. As I noted earlier, this is most likely already taking place at your Program 3 facilities. So if you've already been doing this, good for you. And if not, it's a catch-all to make sure your PSI is correct and up to date. This next item is an amendment to an existing paragraph regarding RAGAGEP, or Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practice. Previously, paragraph D called for facilities to ensure that the process is designed and maintained in compliance. They've altered the language a little bit. Now it must be documented that your process follows RAGAGEP. This subject will come up again later in the presentation when discussing changes to Program 3 process hazard analysis, as this RAGAGEP portion is something that can be included in the node-by-node evaluation of your process. Moving right along to the next item in our prevention program is the process hazard analysis. In my opinion, I do a lot of work with Program 3 facilities, and this is really where you're going to see the bulk of changes or new requirements for your facility to follow. So Title 40, Section 68.67, paragraph C, now lists 10 areas that must be addressed in a PHA. There are 3 new areas, and 2 areas have been expanded because of the RMP rule update. For the next few slides, we're going to go into each of these changes and what will be required of you for your Program 3 facility. So our first element with our updates associated with the process hazard analysis, or your PHAs, is engineering and administrative controls. So Program 3s were previously required to examine controls and their interrelationships. Now, paragraph C3 has been expanded to include the owner or operator shall ensure monitoring equipment associated with prevention and detection of accidental releases from covered processes has standby or backup power to provide continuous operation. So what does this mean for the changes in your PHA? Basically, all future PHAs must ask the question, what if standby or backup power is not provided to monitoring equipment associated with the prevention of and detection of accidental releases? This can be handled as a final question when you're finishing your scenario. You've laid out your consequence, you've risk ranked your consequence, you've laid your safeguards, you've applied the likelihood, and it can be a catch-all at the end. Okay, do these safeguards have backup power? This question can be very beneficial in recognizing gaps in safety that you may have not recognized while performing a PHA before this RMP update. Stationary source citing. So additional verbiage has been added to paragraph C5, reading stationary source citing, including the placement of processes, equipment, and buildings within the facility, and hazards posed by proximate stationary sources, and accidental release consequences posed by proximity to the public and public receptors. So, the EPA noted that this verbiage has been added to recognize that releases from stationary sources can impact public receptors not only through the proximity of the release, but also due to potential secondary releases due to a domino effect by compromising nearby processes. I would like to add here that the EPA did note that while the sharing of chemical and process information between facilities would benefit potential emergency response, they do not believe that this sharing of information is required in order to comply with this requirement. The EPA does, however, expect sites to utilize publicly accessible information on nearby sources, such as RMPs. Another item to note here, this new rule does not expect a facility to modify their process as a result of the citing. Similar to the process used in a PHA, this rule update is meant to shine a light on potential hazards and then leave it to the facility to use the information to determine if additional measures need to be taken. This new update can be handled within your facility citing checklist. The questions shall address each of these new requirements. Our next section for our process hazard analysis updates revolves around natural hazards. A new section has been added, paragraph C8, to ensure that all PHAs address natural hazards that could cause or exacerbate an accidental release. It is up to the facility and the PHA team to determine which natural hazards the facility is susceptible to. And this can be addressed within checklists, such as your facility citing checklists, or within a separate node all of its own. The next portion of the process hazard analysis element is safer technology and alternative risk management measures. Now, this will be a new element to the PHA for any facility outside of California, so I do have a few slides to go with this one, but we'll start out by reading the new paragraph C9, which will require PHAs to address safer technologies and alternative risk management measures applicable to eliminating or reducing risk from process hazards. So for facilities falling under the NAICS codes 324 and 325, which is petroleum and coal products manufacturing and chemical manufacturing respectively, the owner or operator shall consider and document in the following order of preference: inherently safer technology or design, passive measures, active measures, and procedural measures. So before we dive into the details of what this new PHA element will require, I do want to note that the affected facilities listed there on the left in the white blocks will face an additional requirement. So the owner or operator shall also determine and document the practicability of the inherently safer technologies and designs considered. The owner or operator shall include in documentation any methods used to determine practicability. Also, following that method, for any inherently safer technologies and designs implemented, the affected facilities must document and submit to the EPA a description of the technology implemented. In the next couple slides, I will explain what they're looking for or what they're referring to with the inherently safer technologies and designs. So let's dive into what the EPA means by safer technology and alternative risk management measures. So the first choice for managing chemical hazards is the use of inherently safer technologies or inherently safer designs. So these are the most effective when applied during the design phase. For existing facilities, various hazards at your Program 3 facility is managed by a range of controls and safeguards. And these controls range from inherent to various layers of supplemental protections. It's really helpful using the following hierarchy of controls to adequately manage chemical and process hazards. So the first choice to protect against your process hazards is using an inherent protection. So these avoid hazards by using non or less hazardous substances or materials, minimizing the quantity of hazardous substances, or simplifying or moderating process conditions to eliminate or reduce the likelihood or severity of incidents. This is also another layer that's most helpful when applied during design, but there are potential opportunities for existing facilities that I will show you on the next slide. So the next step in our hierarchy is passive protection. So these additions to a process provide a risk reduction benefit with no operator action or energy source required. So some examples are blast shields, sumps, or rupture discs. Moving down the ladder, we go into our active protection. So these are safety features or engineering controls. These include BPCS systems, alarms, or control interlocks. Now our last layer of protection would be procedural safeguards. So these relate to administrative systems that lead to a safe process condition. So this can be our operating procedures, adequate training, or our emergency response procedures. This is really the last line of defense. The EPA provided this flowchart, which I find especially helpful for facilities that are unfamiliar with safer technology and alternative risk management. As I mentioned in the last slide, that first line of defense we want to look at is inherent protections. What hazards can be avoided? Moving on to the dashed box, we're going to look at if there's any opportunities to substitute. Can other chemicals be used to lessen the hazard, or can the process be changed? If not, we'll move on to minimizing. Can the amount of chemical causing the hazard be reduced? We'll then move on to moderation. Can the conditions be changed to lessen the hazard? Can we lower the temperature or the pressure? If not, we then look at our last option here to simplify. Can the process be streamlined? As I mentioned previously, inherent protections are usually applied during the design phase. For our existing facilities, during a PHA, for example, when we're applying safeguards, we're first going to look at passive layers of protection, then active layers of protection, and landing with our final line of defense, procedural layers of protection. In PHAs, if we find that the safeguards are not adequate, we'll most likely be making a process safety recommendation. Now, most of the time, when we're making a process safety recommendation, the team is suggesting layers of protection we can add to lessen the hazard. For those affected facilities I mentioned a few slides ago, the EPA wants to ensure that the facility isn't overlooking any inherent protections that can be applied to lessen those hazards. The last piece of information that is pertinent to note for the changes associated with Program 3 PHAs is the topic of RAGA gap. As I mentioned earlier, the main change with the new rule is that the EPA will now be requiring compliance with RAGA gap to be documented rather than simply ensured. In paragraph C10, it is noted that PHAs will require to address any gaps in safety between the codes, standards, or practices to which the process was designed and constructed and the most current version of applicable codes, standards, or practices. So what I have seen so far is the utilization of a RAGA gap deviation within each node assigned to identifying potential RAGA gap gaps. So your system, as it is configured currently, should be compared against current relevant standards to identify any gaps. And if there is a gap, a process safety recommendation should be made to evaluate what the next step is to close this gap and remain in compliance with this new rule, which satisfies that documentation requirement. Moving on to our next Program 3 Prevention Program element, operating procedures. So Title 40, Section 6869, paragraph A4 has been expanded. It now reads safety systems and their functions, including documentation when monitoring equipment associated with prevention and detection of accidental releases from covered processes is removed due to safety concerns from imminent natural hazards. So, to comply with this expanded requirement, some SOPs at your facility may need to be revised. Specifically, we're looking at SOPs that relate to natural disaster response and/or shutdowns. The EPA noted that this new requirement is to address concern that the threat of natural disasters has been previously used by some facility owners to justify disabling equipment designed to monitor and detect chemical releases of RMP regulated substances. RMP owners, as you know, are required to develop a program to monitor and prevent releases, and the EPA does not believe that natural disasters should be viewed as an exception to this requirement. However, in the extreme cases when it is required, the EPA will allow a facility to shut down monitoring equipment as long as an explanation is included in its RMP. Okay, moving on to compliance audits. So the compliance audit section has undergone a major revision in that third-party compliance audits will now be required when you meet one of the following conditions. So first, if a release has occurred that meets the 5-year accident history criteria listed in section 68.42, paragraph A, or if an implementing agency deems it necessary due to conditions at the stationary source or when a previous third-party audit failed to meet criteria listed in section 68.80, paragraph C. So, if you do meet the latter condition, the implementing agency must provide you written notice stating the reasons for the agency's preliminary determination that the third-party audit is necessary. The facility does have the opportunity to respond by providing information to and consulting with the agency within 30 days of the notice. Following this consultation with the agency will then provide its final determination to the facility, which may be appealed again within that 30-day window. Once the appeal is considered, the agency will then deliver its ultimate decision regarding that third-party audit. So there was some discussion regarding the time frame of this third-party audit, but it was ultimately determined that if the third-party audit is required, it is to be addressed during the next 3-year cycle. It does not have to be completed immediately following this notice. Section 68.80 breaks down the requirements for third-party audits. Paragraph B, noting that the third-party audit can be performed by a single auditor that meets all competency and independence criteria, or a team led by a third-party auditor. The team can consist of other employees of the third-party auditor firm or other personnel belonging to the facility. An interesting point to add here is that it is the third-party auditor's responsibility to determine the appropriate roles and responsibilities for the team members based on their respective qualifications. So moving on to those qualifications. As I just mentioned, the auditor must meet all of the competency and independence criteria laid out in the new rule. So they are as follows. In regards to competency, the auditor must be knowledgeable with the requirements of section 68.80. They must be experienced with the stationary source type and process, along with applicable RAGAGAP, and they must be trained and certified in auditing techniques. For independence criteria, the auditor must act impartially. They must receive no financial benefit apart from payment for the audit. It is noted that retired employees can satisfy this requirement as long as all financial attachments have been severed. The audit team members must all date and sign a conflict of interest statement documenting that they have met the independence criteria. Lastly, no further employment with the owner or operator of the stationary source for a period of at least 2 years following the submission of the final report. The last portion of paragraph C that is interesting is the auditor shall have written policies and procedures to ensure that all personnel comply with the competency and independence requirements of this section, meaning it is a third-party auditor's responsibility to ensure and document that all of these requirements are met rather than the responsibility of the facility. Paragraph D of section 68.80 goes over the third-party auditor responsibilities, which are to manage and participate in the audit initiation, design, implementation, and reporting, determine appropriate roles for team members based on qualifications, which I mentioned a little earlier, to prepare the audit report documenting the full team's views, to certify the final report, and provide a copy of the audit report to the owner or operator. Paragraph E goes over all of the requirements of the audit report itself. There are a lot of overlaps with previous requirements before the new rule, but we will go over these just to get a complete picture. So the audit report should identify all persons participating on the audit team. This should include names, titles, employers, and/or affiliations, and summaries of the qualifications. For third-party auditors, we should include information demonstrating that the competency requirements in the previous paragraph C of this section are met. We should also include the policies and procedures mentioned on the previous slide to ensure competency and independence requirements. These are the policies and procedures that the third-party auditor is responsible for documenting. The report should also document the auditor's evaluation of the facility's compliance with the provisions of this subpart. We should document the findings of the audit, and this new one, summarize any significant revisions between the draft and final revisions of the report. The main changes you'll see between the draft and final revisions of compliance audit reports mainly have to do with recommendations. So from the draft and the final revision, they would like to see a summary of what has changed. And finally, the audit report should include a certification which is signed by the third-party auditor leading the audit. So once the compliance audit is complete, no later than 90 days after receiving the final audit report, the facility must determine an appropriate response to each of the findings in the audit report and develop a findings response report. In the findings response report should include a copy of the final audit report, an appropriate response to each of the findings, a schedule to address the deficiencies found, and a certification signed and dated by a senior corporate officer or equivalent of the facility. Once a schedule to address the deficiencies has been made, the facility must implement the schedule included in the findings response report and document the action taken to address each deficiency along with the date completed. The facility must also immediately provide a copy of the findings response report and the schedule implementation to the owner or operator's audit committee of the board of directors. Paragraph G goes on to record keeping, which states that facilities shall retain the two most recent third-party audit reports, related findings, documentations of actions taken, and related records on site. Moving on to our next Program 3 Prevention Program element, our Incident Investigation, Section 68.81. So there are two additional requirements included in this section. Our first one, in paragraph H1, it states that the report shall be completed within 12 months of the incident unless the implementing agency approves in writing an extension of time. So our first point here is pretty self-explanatory, calling for the report to be prepared at the conclusion of the investigation and within 12 months of the incident. It does allow Program 3 facilities to have an extension for this report if approved by the appropriate agency. Moving on to item 2 here, paragraph H2. The report in paragraph D of this section shall include factors that contributed to the incident, including the initiating event, direct and indirect contributing factors, and root causes. Root causes shall be determined by conducting an analysis for each incident using a recognized method. So the EPA defined root cause as a fundamental underlying system-related reason why an incident occurred that identifies a correctable failure in management systems and, if applicable, in process design. So following the proposal of this new rule, the EPA did respond to inquiries about the implementation or requirement of a specific recognized method to conduct these root cause analyses. Basically, the EPA responded, noting that investigative methods evolve over time and new methods may be developed, which would render any list the EPA proposed as obsolete. So they took a similar stance to that for PHA requirements, where it listed several potential methods and recommends that facilities consult available literatures, such as the Center for Chemical Process Safety,
guidelines for investigating process safety incidents to determine the most appropriate method. Moving on to our next Program 3 Prevention Program element, Section 68.83, Employee Participation. So this element has been significantly expanded. It now includes 6 paragraphs with several subsections. Though this element has been significantly changed with the new RMP rule, I do think it is pretty clear with concise verbiage. It is straightforward, but I do want to include it in this presentation just to make sure we have a complete picture of this new RMP rule. Starting with paragraph A. Paragraph A1 and 2 have been added to address the employee's awareness of the employee participation plan. So paragraph A1 reads, an annual written or electronic notice shall be distributed to employees and their representatives indicating that the plan is readily available to view and how to access the information. That last portion with the access of the information leads into paragraph A2, stating training shall be provided as often as necessary to ensure employees and their representatives and management involved in the process are informed of the details of the plan. Moving right along, paragraph C has been added to address the management of recommendations, specifically requiring employees to be more involved. It reads, the owner or operator shall consult with employees knowledgeable in the process and their representatives on addressing, correcting, resolving, documenting, and implementing recommendations and findings of PHAs, compliance audits, and incident investigations. The next section, paragraph D, ties into paragraph C, as it urges facilities to get their employees more involved in finding solutions. Paragraph D has been added to address employee authorities, and it reads as follows. The owner or operator shall provide the following authorities to employees knowledgeable in the process and their representatives. Paragraph D1 states that we should recommend to the operator in charge of a unit that an operation or process be partially or completely shut down in accordance with procedures established in 68.69a, based on the potential for catastrophic release. And D2, to allow a qualified operator in charge of a unit to partially or completely shut down an operation or process in accordance with procedures established in 68.69a based on the potential for catastrophic release. Paragraph E has been added to address the reporting of unaddressed hazards and gives a little bit of power to the employees to ensure they're in a safe workplace. Paragraph E1 states the owner or operator shall develop and implement a process to allow employees and their representatives to report to either or both the owner or operator and EPA unaddressed hazards that could lead to a catastrophic release. Accidents covered by Section 6842, but not reported under Section 68.195a and any other non-compliance with this part. An important aspect of paragraph E is this paragraph 2, which allows employees to report without fear for losing their positions. The employee and their representatives may choose to report either anonymously or with attribution. Point 3, when a report is made to the owner or operator, a record of the report shall be maintained for 3 years. Our next program element is very simple. It is our hot work permits. Title 40, Section 68.85c has been amended. So hot work permits must be kept for 3 years following the completion of hot work operations. This was included in the new rule, as previously there was some discrepancy amongst multiple sources, but now it has been verified hot work permits must be kept for 3 years. And now moving on to Program 3, Emergency Response. Starting off with non-responding facilities. Section 68.90, paragraph B, has been amended to enhance the responders' ability to respond to an emergency at a Program 3 facility and more efficiently contain the hazard if necessary. Revised paragraph B3 requires the owner or operator to provide to emergency responders timely data and information detailing the current understanding and best estimates of the nature of a release when there is a need for response. It also states the following. The owner or operator may satisfy the requirement in this paragraph through notification mechanisms designed to meet other federal, state, or local notification requirements, provided the notification meets the requirements of this paragraph as appropriate. The next paragraph on this slide, paragraph B6, has been added to address public notification. It says, the owner or operator maintains and implements as necessary procedures for informing the public and appropriate federal, state, and local emergency response agencies about accidental releases and partnering with these response agencies to ensure that a community notification system is in place to warn the public within the area potentially threatened by an accidental release. Documentation of the partnership shall be maintained in accordance with 68.93C. Section 68.95, Emergency Response Program for Responding Facilities, has been amended in a very similar way as Section 68.90 for non-responding facilities. So paragraph 68.95C has been modified to note that the notification systems designed to meet other regulations are acceptable, and paragraph 68.95 A1I has been modified to specify that the owner or operator should partner with local response agencies to ensure a community notification system is in place and to document the collaboration. For responding facilities, Section 68.96, paragraph B1I, has been expanded to clarify that the first emergency response field exercise must be performed before March 15, 2027, and at least every 10 years thereafter. The law does provide an allowance for a longer interval between exercises if the local emergency response agencies deem the 10-year frequency impractical. When that is the case, the facility must consult with the agency on the appropriate emergency response exercise frequency. According to paragraph 68.96 B3, a report must be developed within 90 days of each exercise, including a description of the exercise scenario, names of participants, participating agencies, evaluations, and lessons learned, recommendations for improvement or revisions to the plan, and a schedule for implementation. Moving on to availability of information to the public. Title 40, Section 68.210 has been expanded to ensure covered process information to be made available to the public upon request. There are 5 main categories that we're going to review in this presentation, starting with chemical information, going to languages, notification, time frame, and record keeping. Starting with chemical information, which is paragraph D, upon request by any member of the public residing, working, or spending significant time within 6 miles of the fence line of a stationary source, should have access to names of regulated substances, SDSs, emergency response program information, list of scheduled emergency response exercises, LEPC name, phone number, and web address, along with a list of declined PHA recommendations and justifications. That last bullet point is definitely a new piece that has been added with the new RMP rule. It will take a little bit of work and planning to have this readily available to the public, but it is something that Program 3 facilities need to work out in the near future to remain within compliance. Moving on to languages. The information shall be made available in English or in at least any 2 other commonly spoken languages by the population potentially affected as requested. That one's pretty straightforward, so we'll move on to notification. Paragraph F. The owner or operator shall provide ongoing notification on a company website, social media platform, or through other publicly accessible means that information specified in paragraph D of this section is available to the public residing, working, or spending significant time within 6 miles of the stationary source upon request. This should be relatively easy due to the use of social media by most people and websites held by most facilities. Moving forward to time frame. The owner or operator shall provide the requested information under paragraph D of this section within 45 days of receiving a request. And finally, record keeping, paragraph H. The owner or operator shall maintain a record of the members of the public requesting chemical hazard information for 5 years.
Other areas of technical clarification. Since this presentation has been focused around Program 3 facilities, we've talked about most of these points. So I'll run through them, but pay most attention to the two areas highlighted in yellow, since we haven't touched on those topics yet. So our first one, up-to-date process safety information for Program 3. We discussed that earlier, that our PSI needs to be up-to-date. Program 2 and Program 3 requirements consistent for recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. We did go over RAGAGAP a little bit earlier. Retention of hot work permits. The period of time that hot work permits needs to be kept on site was extended, as we discussed earlier. The next point is storage incident to transportation. So the EPA proposed additional regulatory language that includes a specified number of hours that a transportation container may be disconnected from the motive power that delivered it to the site before being considered part of the stationary source. So initially, the EPA proposed to apply a 48-hour time frame to this term. Since then, there has been ongoing discussion whether or not this time frame is practical for railcar transportation, and some said that being forced to unload certain substances quickly may increase the likelihood for release. So at this point, the topic is still under discussion, but it's something that you should keep your eye on. The next point here, retail facility exemption. So here the EPA clarified that year, in the context of the definition of a retail facility, can either be calendar or fiscal year. So initially there was some discussion if year should be in regard to calendar or fiscal, and after some discussion it has ultimately been decided that it will fall under the facility's responsibility to make that decision for their own facility. And the last point there, RAGAGAP gap analysis. We did go over this a little bit earlier as something we can capture in our PHAs for Program 3s. All right, and finishing up with our critical deadlines. So starting with May of 2024, the new rule was finalized, meaning your facility should have the updated process safety information requirements met, along with those PHA requirements listed in Title 40, 68.67, C, 5, 8, and 10. Also, those operating procedure requirements should be met. Moving on to the end of this year, in December 2024, that's when your annual notification exercise needs to begin. In March 2027, updated emergency response requirements begin then. Moving down the year a little bit to May 2027, we're looking at our third-party compliance audit requirements, updated incident investigation, PHA requirements listed in 68, 67, C, 3, and 9, those updated employee participation requirements, and the updated information availability to the public. And finishing out in May of 2028, that is when the updated RMPs must be submitted. Feel free to pause this screen here and take a screenshot. Keep that in your back pocket. Make sure we stay in compliance. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. That is my email down below, SaigeMcCluskey@rmpcorp.com, or shoot me a phone call anytime, 949-385-6001. I hope to answer any questions you may have. Have a great day.